Last game from the set, and this one's a very unusual game. It's unconventional, it's miscellaneous, whatever you want to call it. It means that it does not conform to a standard game board. You know, our standard sequencing game board, our standard grouping game board. Yeah, this one does not conform to a standard game board. Okay, so there's that initial shock value right there. Okay, so remember to stay calm though, right? This is prep test 79. Now, I don't want to ruin like some PTs for you, but at this point, if you've been doing the prep test in order, which largely you're supposed to do, it shouldn't come as a surprise that you get an unusual game, right? In fact, now I'm surprised when I see a new PT and I don't see an unusual game. That's like shocking for me. Okay, so stay calm, right? Just because a game doesn't have a standard game board doesn't mean it doesn't have a game board. Of course it has a game board. You just need to come up with your own new game board. And there are lots of things you can do to help yourself figure out like what the new game board looks like. You know, you look to the setup, you think carefully about setup, you look at the rules, and you also look at the first question. Typically, the first question is a standard acceptable situation question, and you look at the answer choices of that question. Here's question 18 to get a sense of what the game board looks like, right? So you can do all of that if you stay calm and overcome that initial shock factor, right? And as far as like unusual miscellaneous games go, this one is not that bad. Right? The reason is because the language here is not opaque. It's not. Like, there are some unusual games where I'm reading this stuff, I'm like, what the hell? Like, I can't you have to do so much grammar parsing, right? So much, okay, this referential phrase was referred to here, and then it was referred to again here, right? You really had to spend a lot of time to figure out what the language was trying to say. This one is not like that. This one's actually kind of clear, right? It's pretty clear what it is that we're supposed to do. All right, so let's take a look. So right off the bat, we're told what our game pieces are, and there are 6 of them, P, Q, R, S, T, U. These are computers on a small network, and exactly one of these guys, right, one of you guys, contracted a virus from outside the network. Okay, so I'm thinking I probably have to figure out who it is, you know, who's patient 0, so to speak, who started this whole thing, right? And once you contracted this virus, it was then spread between computers on the network. So see, with that much information, you can already start to play around with this, right? Because your job right now is to figure out what this new game board is supposed to look like, which means, what are you asked to do? See, it's not that opaque. It's pretty clear what you're asked to do. Who started it? I don't know, maybe you started it. And then what happened? Well, you spread to P, right? Who spread to Q, who spread to T, who spread to U, who spread to R. Maybe that's the path the virus took. Likely it's not, right? Or, you know, alternatively, the virus could have taken a different path from S to P to Q, and then from Q immediately all across to T, R, and U, right? So that's another possibility. It doesn't really matter. Like, you're not trying to get it right, of course. You're just trying to play around with the possibilities to get a better handle on the dynamics of the game, right? On like what it is that you're even being tasked to do, right? And to that end, we can even look at question 18, our standard acceptable situation question, to see the game board that they lay out for us, that it lays out for us, right? That each of the answer choices lay out for. And to a large extent, it's confirming what we expected, right? It's confirming what we expected to happen. You just see like game pieces transferring the virus to other game pieces. So let's keep reading here. The next sentence tells us that each computer, that is say each game piece, receive the virus exactly once. Okay, so before we even get into the indented rules, this is already a rule, right? This is rule number 1. And for each game piece, I'm going to represent that with an empty box to indicate that it holds a game piece, right? Or you can write X. Sometimes I use X to represent a generic item, right? And what about it? Well, you're receiving the virus, right? So receiving the virus here, I'm using an arrow. I don't want to use this arrow. This arrow is a conditional arrow, so I associate that with conditionality, so I don't want to misuse that arrow. So I'm going to use this new arrow, right, to indicate that you're receiving the virus exactly once, right? So I write a 1 underneath to indicate that it's not 0 and it's not 2, it's 1, right? So just in case you were wondering if the virus was successful in spreading across the whole network, this rule tells you the answer is yes, because no computer has escaped, right? Every single computer, every single game piece is receiving the virus exactly once, right? So now that's to be distinguished, of course, from pitching, from giving the virus, from transferring the virus, right? This is going into the computer, receiving the virus. That's different from going out of the computer, pitching the virus over to somebody else, okay? And that's what rule number 2, or really it's the first rule in our indented rules, right? In our indented rule list tells us no computer transmitted virus to more than 2 other computers. So starting with this computer, right? What is like the max that you could have transferred? Twice, right? Twice, 2. But you don't want to just write a 2 here because that kind of suggests that you did in fact transfer. So no, this is just the max. What's the minimum, right? What is the minimum? Is it 1? Could it be less than 1? Right? It can be 0. Right? It can be from 0 to 0, meaning you're at the tail end. You know, it transferred you and it just stopped. You didn't transfer anybody else, right? Maybe there's more than one tail end, right? Maybe you started it, you transfer to you, and you transfer to you, and then you transfer to you, and then it stops, and then you transfer to you, and then you transfer to you, and it stops, right? So you see, you guys aren't pitching to anybody, right? Everyone has to receive at least once, and you are the guy, R, pitched twice, right? Sent it to 2 other computers. Okay, so this is all like pretty standard fare, right? See, what I just did was what we always do with logic games, which is when you receive a rule, you try to push it up against your game board with your game pieces to see how the rule interacts, right? So now I know I don't have a game board, right? I don't have one, right? But really, you get a sense of like what the game board must look like, and it's just something like boxes pushing into other boxes, right? Maybe it looks something like this. All right, so let's keep going here. Next rule tells us about S, and it says that S transmitted virus to exactly 1 computer on the network. So S did not pitch twice, S pitched exactly once. So that's good, actually. Instead of writing my rule list, I'm just going to write as part of my game board, S, right? And then I'm going to write an arrow out from S, and I'm going to arrow it over to a box to represent the rule that S pitched over to exactly 1 other game piece. Okay, so using this rule, I want to look at question 18, but I can't really eliminate anything. Right here you don't even see S. Here you have S pushing to R, S pushing to U, so that's all fine. Okay, let's keep going. Next we learned that the computer that transmitted to R is the same computer that transmitted to S. Okay, so instead of writing that in my rule list, I also just want to write that into my game board. I wanted to append it to this if possible. Right, and we can because we're talking about S again, so whoever gave the virus to R, right, whatever this item is that gave the virus to R, also gave it to S. Right, so this is how I want to represent it, and now I've successfully hooked up this rule with my previous rule. Okay, so now take stock, right? Take stock of what items are left. I already see 1, 2, 3, 4 items on my game board out of 6. I only have 2 other items. Now I know these 2 aren't like determined which ones they are, but look, that's 4 out of 6. This game board is pretty set, right? Like where could these other 2 boxes go? Well, just consider this over here. Right, you already got 2 things coming out of it. You've hit your max, right? So maybe you start the whole chain, maybe, or maybe you have 1 thing going into you. That's possible, right? R's already got 1 thing going into it, so this part's done, right? What about after R? Well, R could potentially push to 1 or push to 2 or push to 0. It could be the tail end too, right? S is completely done. 1 thing going in, 1 thing going out. S is completely done. S only gets that 1 thing, right? And what about this box item? Well, it's got 1 thing going in, so again, it could be the tail end, or it could push 1 out, or it could push 2 out, right? So we're getting there. Okay, so before moving on to the next rule, let's once again take a look at question 18. And now we can actually eliminate some answers, right? Because I know there's no way R is pushing into S or S is pushing into R. They're both getting pushed into from 1 item. So this one, S pushing into R, no good, right? And the others, okay, they survive. And next up, rule number 3 tells us that it's either T or R. I'm not sure which one, but it's one of them that's pushing into Q. Right? It's one of them because, well, rule number 1 tells you Q only gets to have 1 thing pushing into it. So here, we can represent that by just having an arrow push into Q, and then before it, right, we know it's T or it's R. And with this rule, we can eliminate, let's see, T to Q is fine, U to Q is not okay, so C's gone, R to Q is fine, R to Q is fine. And finally, our last rule, rule number 4, is very similar to rule number 3. This time we're told that it's either going to be T or it's going to be U that pushes over into P. So with this rule, let's take a look at the answers here. R to P is no good. A is gone. This one, U to P is fine. This one, T to P is fine. So what do we do now between D and E? Right? It seems like we exhausted our rules, and this is quite unusual. But actually, what happened was, remember, this rule did not eliminate anything. Right? So if you look at these 2 answer choices, this one has 4 out of the 6 items. This one has 5 out of the 6 items, which means this map is almost done. Right? What's happening here? Right? What's happening here is that P is pushing to R. Right? If P is pushing to R, P's this item. Right, so P must also be pushing into S, right? If P's pushing in S, look, our game board calls for 1 other thing, right? S has to push to somebody else, but you don't have anybody else. You've used them all up, right? So E is a contradiction. That's why D is correct. So now, before heading into the other questions, we have to make a very important decision, and that's whether we want to split this game board, right? To make that decision, typically the rule of thumb is you consider how many questions are left. And here we have 5 questions that are left, 3 of which don't give us additional premises, right? You compare the number of questions left to how many game boards you think you're going to get. Here, I'm looking at like rules 3 and 4. These seem to be the split nodes. So if I choose TQ, right, you keep that fixed, TQ, I get 2 game boards, right? TP is 1, UP is 1. So now I switch it up. RQ, I keep this fixed. I get 2 more game boards, TP, UP. So that's 4 game boards. So it's like close enough, you know? So in this lesson, I'm going to go ahead and not split the game board, right? Show you how to do the questions without splitting. But in a separate lesson, I'll split the game board. You can decide for yourself which way you feel more comfortable with. I feel like they're about the same. So skipping over question 19, we're going to do 20 first. Just as a general rule of thumb, you want to do your questions with additional premises first. So 20 is a must-be true question with an additional premise that T does not transmit to anybody. Okay, so that's our new premise. You take it and you push it in with your old premises. Look, rules 3 and 4 immediately implicated because they have T. So if T doesn't get to transfer to anybody, right, look, it's R to Q, U to P. Right, so you write down your new game board somewhere in the blank space below. You write question 20, circle it, make it very, very neat, right? Just like this, 20, and then you copy the game board over. And now you make your inferences, like R has to push into Q. Okay, so that goes into this, right? R goes into Q. This rule is taken care of. Now what? Right? If you're feeling stuck or paralyzed, what do we do? I must have asked you this question like a dozen times before. What do you do when you feel stuck or paralyzed? Take stock of what's left, right? You got 3 game pieces already placed, 2 box items already in there, out of a total of 6, which means you have 3 items left. What are your 3 items? Well, T is one of them, right? And the other 2 items is your rule number 4. U pushes into P. Okay, so once you take stock of what's left, now you can start thinking about, well, what do I do? Right, this thing is pushing into 2 items. It's not going to be T. T doesn't get to push into anybody. Right, it can't be U either. U's already pushing into P. If you push it into 2 more, that's 3 in contradiction of this rule. Right, so it has to be P that occupies this slot, this box. Right, so P's pushing into here, which means U is pushing into P over here, which means there's only 1 spot left, and T has to occupy that spot, which is just fine because T doesn't get to push into anybody. Right, so now with this game board figured out, let's take a look at what must be true. PS, yep, that's right, P has to push into S. The next question with additional premise is question 23, and that's a must-be true question, and our additional premise is that P is the only item that pushes into 2. Okay, so only P gets to do this, nobody else. So you take this new premise, you see how that plays out on your game board, and look, this is the item that has to push into 2, and now we're told only P gets to push into 2, well then P has to be this item, right? So you write very neatly somewhere in the blank below 23 with a circle, you copy your game board over to indicate that this is the sub game board for a question 23, and then you put your new rule right into the game board. So P goes into R and S. So now what? Well, you take your new rule and you see what old rule it implicates. Right, and one of the easiest ways to do that is to see what items repeated. And here P is repeated, so rule 4 is implicated. Rule 4 is telling us who goes into P, who pushes into P. And I only get 2 options, either T or U. So okay, that makes this right for splitting. So I'm going to copy the game board over here, right, exactly the way it is, which means P goes here. And on top, I'll just say it's U, or rather T. I said U, but I wrote T. And on bottom, I'll write U goes into P. Right, so there, I've visually represented Rule 4 across my 2 sub game boards. Rule 4 is taken care of. No need to pay attention to it anymore. So now what? Right? Don't get stuck. Don't get paralyzed. Take stock of what's left. I see 5 items here. I'm almost done, right? 5 items here too. So what's missing on top? Well, Q's missing. What else is missing? U is missing, right? What's missing on bottom? Q's missing and T's missing, right? Because you split on TU, so those are the other 2 items, right? Of course, the last thing, the shared item that's missing is Q, right? Rule 3 talks about it. Okay, so now what? Well, let's consider one board at a time. This top board here, S has to push into somebody, right? You can't leave this blank. This is calling for one of you. Who is it? It's not going to be Q, right? Q can't get pushed into by S. Q has to get pushed into by T or R, so it has to be U that takes up this spot. And same thing down here. It can't be Q, so it has to be T that takes up this spot. So what happens to Q up here? Well, Q has to get pushed into by T or R, but see, you can't have T push into Q because then that will violate this rule. Only P gets to push twice. T doesn't get to push twice. So Q has to get pushed into by R in our top game board. Whoops, this should be a Q. And in the bottom game board, well, actually in the bottom game board, you have an option because R is at the tail end right now and T's at the tail end. So either one really, right? Either one really could push into Q here. So I'm not sure. I'll just write a push into Q like this. And I'll say like, maybe it's here, maybe it's here, right? So that's it. Now with these two, or really I suppose this is 3 game boards, right? This is 2 game boards, right? With the 3 game boards, let's see what must be true. S pushes to T. Well, it doesn't have to be true. It could be true. T pushes into P. Again, it could be true, but it doesn't, right? It doesn't have to be true. Q pushes into nobody. Yeah, that must be true. Q's at the tail end, no matter what. So now we'll return to question 19, which wants to know which item could have started it all, right? Who could have started it all? Well, immediately from your game board, you can tell that R and S didn't start it because somebody pushed into them. So you can get rid of R and get rid of S. And then if you look at your rules, you'll notice that Q couldn't have started it, neither could P, right? So that's A and B gone. E is the right answer. Question 21 says any of the following game pieces could have pushed into 2 except for which one, right? So it's saying any of you could have been this box that pushed into 2 except for one of them. So we're going to circle 4 quote-unquote right answer choices, right? Because 4 of you could have done this. So now it really pays off to look at question 23, right? Which we just see that P definitely can push to 2. Okay, so we can get rid of answer choice A. Now, what about B, Q? Right, we don't have any game boards that show Q pushing into 2, but let's just try it. Let's say Q goes, say, over here, right? So Q goes over here. That's 2. So who pushes into Q? Well, it's not going to be R. R's over here now, so it has to be T that pushes into Q, right? Oh, by the way, you should definitely write 21 B, right? Circle it, very neat, and then copy your game board over. Right? You might have to refer to this later, so it's very important to just stay neat. Okay, so now while you're at it, right, why don't you try to satisfy D as well and have T push into 2 things, right? Have T push into P as well. So now this is satisfied. You got T pushing into Q. This is satisfied. You got T pushing into P. And then that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What's your final item? It's U. And yeah, everything's fine. So we just got rid of answer choices B and D. All right, let's try C, R. So first we'll copy the game board over, label it 21C, right, circle it. So R pushing into 2 items looks like this, right? So notice that everything's on the game board now. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 game pieces, right? Everybody is here. So I think to satisfy rule number 3, I have to have R push into Q because I don't quite see how I can have T push into Q anywhere. None of these boxes are connected. Right, so, okay, R has to push into Q. That just takes care of rule number 3. I'm still screwed up for rule number 4. I can't get T to push into P or U to push into P because, once again, my remaining 3 boxes, my remaining 3 blank spaces are disconnected. So I have to fail rule number 4, right, which is why this is the contradiction. It doesn't work for R to push into 2 items. So last question, 22, wants to know if which one of the following is true. Is our game board completely determined? Right, so this is a kind of question that we've definitely encountered before. It happens quite frequently on logic games. Completely determined game board, if which is true. And some of you more astute 7-stagers will undoubtedly have honed in on answer choice C. Right, your spider senses just went off on answer choice C because you're sensitive like that. Now, where does that come from? You know, and if you're not, how can you hone your sensitivities, right, such that answer choice C speaks to you? Well, it has to do with the fact that if you're trying to completely determine the game board, you're trying to pick something super restrictive. You're trying to pick something, in other words, that pushes out a ton of inferences, right? So you look at answer choice A, RQ, and you're just like, okay, RQ, I don't know, I still got to decide TP or UP, right? So probably not this one. TQ, okay, TQ, I still got to decide TP or UP, probably not this one. But TS, right? T has to go here. Right, push into S, which also robs T from rule number 3 and robs T from rule number 4 rather, which forces R to push into Q, which forces U to push into P. See, that's a good suspect, right? So, and if you were sensitive enough to try out answer choice C, well, you're very good with logic games, right? That's a level of mastery of logic games that's not very common. So good for you, right? If not, this is where having done previous questions help a lot. So for answer choice A, we can look back at question 23, right? R pushes to Q. Well, I see 2 versions of R pushing into Q, right? So 2 versions of R pushing into Q. So no way it's determined, okay? So no way. A's out. Now for B, T pushing into Q, right? I see 1 version here where T pushes into Q, right? In question 23, 1 version where T could push into Q. And question 21 has another version where T can push into Q. So definitely also not completely determined. So now answer choice C, T pushes into S, so T has to go here, right? T has to go here to push into S, which robs T from rule 3, robs T from rule 4, which determines rule 3. It's R that pushes into Q, so go ahead and write that in. R pushes into Q over here. Rule 3 is taken care of. And now take stock of what's left. You have 1, 2, 3, 4 items already placed. 2 items are left out of the 6, right? And those 2 items are U and P, right? So the only place for them to go is here. U has to go here. P can't go here. P goes here. Then you got 2 things pushing, right? S pushes into P, and then U pushes into P. No good, right? So it has to be U that goes here, which pushes into P, which is completely determined. C is right. Hi there, this is JY from 7th Sage. If you found this lesson helpful, then you'll probably also find our LR and RC lessons helpful as well. Those are on 7thsage.com. I hope to see you there.